All right. I know Andrew's coming, but I think we can get started and dive in here a bit. So we'll take it section by section again and see what we can pull out and wrestle with here. So first section of Shunyata and History, chapter 6 here, our final chapter. Uh, I love this section. I really like this idea of Samskrita that he brings up at the bottom of 220, which is going to appear again in the sections we've yet to read. So a good term to note, translated as being at doing, being at doing. Um, so I kind of conceive of this as bringing this idea of time of becoming into this notion of shunyata, of emptiness that he's been developing throughout the text here. But he hasn't fully encapsulated this idea yet at this point. He's just sort of introduced it at this first section here. But I think it's a very insightful observation of the nature of our lives. At some point, he mentions how even sort of making the choice to do nothing, that's still an action in a sense, viewed from a certain vantage point, anyways. Um, and yeah, this obligation, or this language of obligation or burden or debt that he uses is, I mean, it's certainly it's pretty deep and heavy language. But I think what he's talking about here with this, I think it has a lot of theological resonances, especially in the Christian tradition, where there's uh, always been this debate about works and the salvific or lack thereof function of works. So, yeah, the idea is that we're always doing something, and the nature of our existence in the world, our existence in time, is to be constantly sort of thrust forward in a incessant becoming that we don't really have a choice in the matter. But so there's something that something pretty troubling about that situation in a sense. There's no way to repay that debt uh, by acting in a certain way, because that action itself also bears this mark of a debt. So, all right, I'll close my trap here. I went on a real spiel there, but yeah, I really wanted to pinpoint that concept because that one really hits home for me. I've been excited to get to it for a number of weeks now. So I wanted to highlight that quickly. So, uh, any thoughts on this idea of being at doing, Samskrita, or anything else in this first section of Shunyata and history?
Yeah, I'm wondering what the Western equivalent of that might be, because it seems like Buddhism is more aware of kind of the notion of samsara as always needing to be involved with the impermanence of birth and death as something that the original Theravada Buddhism was trying to get away from.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to think of what, like, it almost seems like the Western theology or philosophy is less apt to put it in those terms as something to get away from. But I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Like sin seems like a very different concept, for example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me, I'd probably take it to Reformation theology, and this whole debate about works that was so big at that point, and how the reformers basically all in their own ways kind of rejected the salvific function of works, and instead focused on this idea of grace. So even though we obviously are sort of stuck in a nexus of works in our lives here, I think Nishitani and Luther say would be in some degree of agreement about this kind of conversion that would happen. Luther would certainly talk about it in terms of faith and grace, but you're not going to be able to get out of this. Well, you're never going to be able to get out of the samskrita, the being at doing, but to sort of settle in to our home ground there. I think they have similar ideas about how that kind of conversion would happen.
Right, like relinquishing the attempt to get out of it using your own doing, because it just creates a self-feedback loop. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Reminds me a bit of time travel, and the fallacies of time travel fiction, right? You know, time travel really only started, that type of science fiction really only started with the Enlightenment. I mean, even post-Enlightenment, in the Industrial Revolution. And it seems to, from my perspective, indicate a kind of a commodification of time, right? A spatialization of time is probably the best way to do that, right? Something that you can chart, something you can manipulate, which is, of course, what was happening in the Industrial Revolution with timetables, things like that. But you can see traces of things like that all the way back to Augustine in a way, because if you read Augustine's Confessions, you see his he conceives of time as something you can stand outside of. That's kind of, to me, that seems like a mistake. I think if eternity exists, and I think it does, we need to conceive of it differently. Not at the expense, not because we can spatialize time, because time is not space. Time transcends space, and that's what time is. It is the transcendence of space, in a way, right? It is the way in which I am not what I was when I started this sentence, right? There's a weird way in which everything is always transcending itself as we think it, as we see it, because it keeps going. Time isn't reversible, space is. You can return to the same space, you can't return to the same time. And that seems to me to speak to a fundamental feature of the nature of reality, is that one aspect of reality is you can return to it and the other you can't. And you know, this is interesting because it's actually a really common thing for autistic children to assume that you can return to previous times. Interestingly, they tend to treat time like space. They think, when are we going to be like that again? But this still happens over and over again, which I find very interesting. And I don't know why, but I wonder if it has to do with a relationship with the body and with the environment, right? And the feeling that, you know, I am someone who can create effects, who lives in the world of time as, you know, an effect and a cause, something like that. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that, you know, this Cartesian, not just Cartesian, but this Western attitude of treating time like a commodity or something to be charted, you know, stands against what you were talking about and what Nishitani was talking about as being and doing, right? In a sense, it treats time like just another dimension of space, but it's not. It's the thing that makes us human, the thing that makes us active and individual and you know, all of those really good things.
I think the autistic point, often they have more like left hemispheric dominance, and the left hemisphere tends to abstract from time and instrumentalize things. So like maybe you see time as some kind of thing that can be measured and used as a tool.
Right, for sure. And I think one of the things, tell me if I'm wrong about the left hemisphere, is that it tends to assume it has a God's eye view, so to speak. It tends to not question its view. Would you say that's right, Connor?
Yeah, it doesn't appreciate context the way the right hemisphere does.
Right. You know, and a big feature of what some people have described as autistic symptomology is context blindness. Right? The inability to notice, you know, the difference between certain situations, background, foreground, which gives a remarkable attention to detail, but a lack in that kind of appreciation of context. Yeah. Which depends on time, actually. Yeah.
So
when he talks about being is doing, is that a negative trait? Because later he talks about his unique conception of admitting to the futility of history or exiting history, where he talks about in Nietzsche talks about the eternal return, and he kind of says, oh, Nietzsche kind of by happenstance kind of got a glimpse of what it means to exit out of history, and he bemoans the modern look of history is, oh, there's this grand epic story and humanity's at the center, or the traditional Christian or Jewish view of history is that, oh, there's a grand epic story and we're actors in God's great drama. So it led me to think that when he talked about being is doing, he's kind of like bemoaning the human need to always do something, to always be active, and not to be able to come to terms with that there's a certain degree of futility in everything we do.
Yeah, I think this idea has a lot of layers for him, definitely. I think I mean, certainly there's that idea of kind of what we talked about right at the beginning, before we jumped in, about kind of this busyness. And much earlier in the text he was talking about how, well, that's the situation where your nihility is sort of immediately underfoot for you, because you're just kind of pushing yourself forward and kind of trying to ignore the groundlessness of life. So there's that resonance, certainly. But I mean, nihility isn't necessarily a bad thing for him. And especially with this connection he's drawing between nihility and time and becoming here, there's something of just a kind of a realism to what he's saying. He's just kind of describing the situation here. And certainly with nihility being the conversion point to this field of shunyata that he wants us to achieve. This can be a good thing in a way. So I think there's sort of a double aspect to it. If we're stuck in our kind of day-to-day field of cognition, this being at doing can be a unconscious sort of experience, or it can be kind of a rough experience when we kind of hit up against the nihility of it and aren't prepared for that. But ultimately it's sort of a just kind of the feature of reality. So it's not like we can get away from it. He has that bit about how even not acting is a form of this being at doing. So it's our samsara that we're stuck in, but it's the same samsara that is nirvana. Is how I'm interpreting it, kind of.
But if we look back at what he said in earlier weeks about he was idealizing meditation and Zen and relinquishing all of our words, if we do that, are we exiting the game of compulsively trying to be by doing?
I think the keywords may be compulsively. I think then we're not operating so much on this field of cognition. We're not sort of slaves to our karma, to use very Buddhist language. But I think we're still in this being at doing nexus. Because I mean, he talks a little bit about how we have our being in time and we have our being as time. So there's, with that in mind, there's really no being that isn't becoming. There's no way we can use our mind or shift our attitude in any kind of way to stop becoming from happening. Even if we're doing zazen, we're sitting, we have empty mind, things are still in time, things are still becoming. But the phenomenology of that would definitely be different, I'd say.
Coleman gave a very interesting. Oh, sorry. Did you want to comment?
I got kind of a lengthy thought. Maybe I can hold it for a minute.
Okay. Hillman said something very interesting once, and we've talked about James Hillman, but he said that maybe, because we're an implicit idea here, maybe not explicit, is the end of time, right? Is that what does the end of time mean, right? And that's tied in with the messianic version of history. with the Jewish, Islamic, Christian version of history, right? And to me, what James Hillman reads that at is very idiosyncratically and kind of uniquely. He says that's the end of seeing history as time. That the end of time could be interpreted as, and he just proliferates contradictory interpretations galore because that's what he does. That's psychology, right? But one of the interpretations he gives is maybe the end of time is the end of keeping time. The end of time is the end of seeing life in terms of a destination. When we reach the destination, that's the end of time, right? And we return to a world independent of clocks, right? We return to a world of presence, and that's that probably, but that might happen. I wonder if a linear narrative of history, a narrative focused history, even though I'm Christian and even though that this Judeo-Christian model is really central to not just my religion and some of ours, but the Western worldview we share. It makes me wonder if what would happen if that's a self-destructive thing, right? If it is intentionally that way, right? If it's intended to create a telos, but then something happens after it, right? And I wonder about that, right? Could the linear model of history be a meaningful detour from the default of cyclical models of history?
No.
I mean, he kind of talks a bit about that lack of teleology and the Unschuld des Werdens, the innocence of becoming, Nietzsche's phrase, where it's like trans-teleological or like beyond having a particular purpose once you get to that point.
Right. And I mean, in many cultures, indigenous cultures, Hinduism, all that kind of stuff, right? The world is more cyclical, right? The world isn't linear. It's not an arrow, it's a circle, right? And that seems to be the default. It seems to be. And I choose to believe that the linear model of history I believe in has a meaning, but maybe that meaning is within a larger context. Maybe it has a purpose, but it has only one purpose among several, something like that. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that if we're talking about time and destinations and the futility of doing, maybe the point of doing is to realize the futility of doing.
That's the big challenge. I mean, and actually, Andrew, I'm interested to know your perspective from a Buddhist perspective. I mean, is that part of Buddhism to just relinquish? Because in the West we have this amazing faith in progress in a better future, and certainly that's at the heart of Judaism. Is this concept that the whole point of everything is to lead to the Messianic era, when there's a time when everything's going to be perfect, and there may be incremental steps towards that. Does Buddhism reject that? Does Buddhism say, no, actually, that whole drama is a lie? What you're supposed to do is just make peace with what is and forget about this drama of history. Is that the Buddhist view?
I'd be very hesitant to speak for Buddhism because basically, I have like one very particular angle and like perspective on Buddhism, which is like unusual within that world. And then I'm somewhat estranged from this organization, right? So it's like, not entirely, right? But it's not really my perspective either. So I don't know what Buddhism thinks. I don't know what Zen thinks. I don't know if the two are identical. I don't know whether my father's organization's perspective is identical with either of those. And I'm not sure if my perspective is identical with any of them. So
sorry to put you under the microscope. I apologize.
I love to talk about this stuff. But I'd say very broadly speaking, right? I see Buddhism as more concerned with what is, and Western religion concerned with what should be or will be. It's a real broad brush. Can I bring up some of the points I was going to bring? Okay,
please.
So what I'm interested in is this idea of the perception of time, and how it's connected with the issue of free will. And what I see them as sharing in common is these are basically perceptions which may or may not be realities. So my question for Stav is, and I'm sorry, is it Stav or Stav?
Stuff.
Stav. Are you familiar with the Ishbitzer Rebbe?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, this is very, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. This is a very interesting perspective within Judaism. That's basically what we call, from a Western philosophical perspective, what you'd call determinist. It's, and that's very unusual within the Jewish world, which takes free will as kind of its starting point, right? So this is sort of, I wouldn't call it like it's within the mainstream of the Jewish tradition, but it's kind of a weird little sideline within it. Would you agree with the way?
Yeah, no, he's not mainstream at all. I mean, he's not common.
But I mean, he's not a heretic either.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Because it's very hard to be a heretic. As long as you follow the mitzvot, you can have any theology you like. I mean,
That's
right.
so admirable. It's so easy to be a heretic when you're a Christian. Holy cow.
That's a whole other conversation. But
Sure.
so what's interesting to me is okay. Maybe we have free will, maybe we don't, maybe time is linear, maybe it isn't. But this perception that it is very persistent, and it's very resistant to attempts to correct it, right? So even if my belief is that everything is determined, or even if my belief is that time is cyclical, the perception in my mind is still very, very on the surface, it sure appears as if time and free will are real. And I remember we talked in the Corban group about the Greek ideas of chronos and kairos. So they had these different notions of time, right? One is basically clock time. The other is can contract or dilate depending on the circumstances. And I'm sure we've all experienced that in our own lives. Times when time appears very contracted and times when it appears very dilated. But generally speaking, time doesn't run backwards. Right? There are times where you might be thrown back into some previous chapter in your life, and it can seem as though everything is cyclical. But for the most part, it seems to me like things move from one state toward another, and they don't go back the other way around, irrespective of whether that's what's really happening. So I'm just really interested in this discrepancy between perception and reality, and if we understand that there's this gap, can we trust our perception? And if not, what should we trust?
That's fascinating. I think perhaps the last paragraph in this section might shed some light on your question. So page 222. Lastly, we said that time only comes about in virtue of having an infinite openness at its bottom. This infinite openness also contains an ambiguity of its own. In a word, it can mean both nihility and shunyata in its original sense. According to the meaning it takes on, time and all matters related to time will assume meanings fundamentally opposed to one another. The true form of time consists in the simultaneous possibility of these opposing meanings. The essential ambiguity in the meaning of time means that time is essentially the field of fundamental conversion, the field of a change of heart, or metanoia, pravritti vijnana.
This is one of the points I feel compelled to push back a little bit. This is some of the issue I take with the use of language in this book, and some of it is, of course, translation, right? But what is a field? What's this field that we keep talking about?
Great question.
I wonder if a field is a word for a system of, or I don't know, it's hard to not use a synonym, right? Something that isn't a thing that's real, right? Something that isn't ontic, to use Heideggerian language, but that creates effects. Something that you can't point to, but that things share in common. Maybe, I don't know.
Mhm.
Yeah, I typically interpret it as like a perspective, kind of like Vervaeke's participatory and perspectival knowing. Like when someone's in a certain mind state, they're in this field of viewing things in that way.
So it's
Mhm.
so it's a psychological state.
That's how I tended to interpret it.
Interesting.
Um,
I'd bet it'd be sort of a transjective sort of
Yes.
thing where it's yes, it has a psychological aspect to it, but it's yeah, it's also, I mean, not ontological because then we're getting into a very being focused metaphysics, but definitely I like
Seems
to
like it's more like a potentiality or a
yeah.
Yeah,
possibility.
I think it's like spirit, wouldn't you say? Like in its original meaning, like in many languages, spirit. You know, in Hebrew it's ruach, isn't it? I don't know how to pronounce it, right? But, you
It's
know,
Ruach.
the breath, the wind, the spirit, they all are related meanings, right?
So so does that mean it's like another type of realm, like in a Neoplatonic sense, like there's different categories of being?
Well,
I projected my own metaphysics on. I just assumed it
Right.
was a higher realm.
Well, I guess I mean, on the purely phenomenological level, I wonder if what we're talking about when we talk about a field is what we talk about when we talk about the air. You know, something we all live in, right?
Mhm.
An atmosphere, right? Something that I breathe in and you breathe out, and I breathe out and you breathe in, right? Something that we participate in together. Something
That
like
just
that.
means it's like a space like any other. It's like
I suppose, but I mean, space is a field, and space is weirder than it often appears to be, right? Space is context. Space is
Mm.
not anything that belongs in space. Space is transcendent, you know?
it's really interesting that it's such a rudimentary basic word that's been used so many times in this text, and we don't really seem to have alignment on what he means by that. It's really
Right.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I think it's like something that affords certain types of actions. Like someone said potential. I think it is pretty importantly tied to potential rather than actual.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. I wonder how it would relate to some Heideggerian language like horizon or region. It's certainly a spatialized metaphor for something that I'm not sure in actuality is necessarily spatial, even in sort of a broad conception. Like I don't know that a field in this sense is sort of some other realm apart from the actual that we find ourselves in.
He
In our
probably
own
has a
lives.
lot of contemporary physics in mind, honestly, right? The
Well, I
phys-
think that resonance is not accidental.
oh, for sure, yeah. I mean, you look at that diagram from earlier, right? That's an atomic diagram, you know, the circular thing,
Ooh.
right? You know, that's what that is. It references the Copernican revolution and all of those things, right? But it's all the idea that, you know, that we aren't just pinpoint. You know, we aren't at the center that we think we're at, right? And I think that's the point of the field. That language is to say that we're not concentric with each other, with ourselves. Excuse me, right? We're not concentric. We aren't a single pinpoint of light that is somehow connected with everything else by a pineal gland somehow, right? You know, like we can figure out, and then the pineal gland has a pineal gland, and the pineal gland inside the pineal gland has a pineal gland, or whatever, right?
Mhm.
But you know, that's what the field overcomes is the continuity of of what's inside with what's outside. I would wager.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly deeply related to this idea of shunyata or emptiness. I mean, certainly he talks about the field of shunyata or the field of nihility. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how far we can get with language to sort of pinpoint some of this.
Well, I mean,
But
it's a noun, but I don't think it is a noun. I think that's the difficulty. I
mhm.
think it's most like a verb probably, and you know that's what makes Heidegger so difficult is that he's aware of the fuzziness between nouns and verbs when we talk about things like this. You know, things like this.
Yeah.
But you know, like is being a thing, right?
Yeah, I brought up, I think it was the last discussion, this book that basically brings up the analytic the continental Anglo-American divide. Let me see if I can dig up this quote because I think it's germane to this point.
Mhm.
I mean, the analytic is very ontic, to use Heidegger's phrase, right? Very focused on beings and not, being. It's focused on the pinpoint of things that you can label, right?
Mhm.
Well, the trouble, okay, I've heard it said that wisdom begins with defining terms.
Right.
And if you introduce a whole lot of new vocabulary and you don't define it, it's difficult to agree or disagree.
Yeah, yeah.
That's true, but it's also true that letters don't have definitions. What I mean is that words arise from letters, but that by themselves are meaningless.
Right.
And I think sentences can be the same way. I do get the sense that in a certain level, it doesn't matter what word you use if the gestalt of meaning arises from a combination of words.
Yeah.
There's actually something that comes up later in the book that I want to bring up. That's exactly what you just said. Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I mean, I can wait, Connor, if you want.
Oh, go ahead.
So it's actually in chapter 2 on page 230. Well, and 229. When they bring up the quote from Nietzsche, Es gibt nichts außer dem Ganzen, there's nothing outside of the whole. And then later he goes on to talk about it. And I kind of maybe compulsively obsessed about it a little bit. So then realizing that, I'm like, this isn't the point. But the phrase "es gibt" in German, it literally translates to "it gives," but that's like a very big faux pas. Native German speakers would say "there is" or "there are," so it kind of like. I don't know if he's trying to get to something here when later he says, when the field of eternity, that is the field of transcendence, opens up, it gives, as gift, as giving to the world. So it's kind of like a having versus being.
I mean, that's the whole paradox of any attempt to describe the absolute, isn't it? I mean, I don't know if that's what Nietzsche was doing, but is that you have to use a subject and a predicate, and that's already two, right? If you're describing one, then if you're predicating a subject, then you're ascribing multiplicity to something that's intrinsically unified, and that's a problem. And that's really a big part of why language can't approach these types of experiences easily. And that's what's going on with the es gibt thing, right? Is, to me, it's like there is nothing. Well, if there's nothing, what is the there, right? Like, why are we calling nothing a thing, right? I thought it was no thing. Didn't we establish that, right? why are we calling no thing a thing, right? And you see the difficulties that arise here.
Yeah, I was just going to say that like all words are at root metaphors, like grounded in physical reality, and the definitions just bring on other words for definition as well. And so I think like Nietzsche as well does this, where he like uses words to kind of try to activate a more intrinsic association rather than having a technical definition for it. And then also regarding the field, the last point was, I feel like he's saying it's always present, but not necessarily realized as such. And then I like the association of the physics, the quantum physics, where there's a field of electrons where you don't know exactly where they are. It could have some convergence with the idea of the anatman, where the self is not in one particular place, but can kind of move around based on your perception, like thou art that, and so on.
I just saw that you shared, Andrew, the something about James's dichotomy between.
Yeah, and I'm sharing. So I found the passage. It's too long to share in its entirety verbally, but I'm just copying it and putting it in the chat. Go on, please.
Oh, nothing. I was just saying that I know about that dichotomy, right, between the tender-minded and the tough-minded. James was on the side of the tough-minded, actually. He didn't like the tender-minded, which is interesting.
And then I wanted to say something too about the field. This whole chapter just kept reminding me of Donnie Darko, the movie I brought up last time. So, I mean, I don't know if they're trying to get at this or more of just like the eternal recurrence, but it's very, I like even specific words in it. I was just like, it really reminds me of Donnie Darko.
What was the connection you made with Donnie Darko? I'm so sad I didn't come last time now.
Oh, I don't know specifically, but just reading it just makes me think of it.
Well, the thing about Donnie Darko that really struck me is that it's a threshold experience. That's what it's about, right? It's a religious experience. You know what esotericists would call meeting the guardian at the threshold. You know, he stands in front of that mirror. You know, it's kind of like Korban or like Ibn Arabi would call your Lord. You know, the image, right? And he's inviting you, kind of like Alice through the looking glass, to pass beyond appearance to the place where you are united with your being, something like that, right? And you see that metaphor all over. It's about time. It's about, you know, like passing through a threshold, a moment of, you know, of no time and no space in a weird way. I need to see the movie again, but it really struck me, right? It also, you know, Donnie Darko was like eerily related to 9/11, like lots of things at the time before 9/11, right? Like you've seen that Simpsons episode, I'm sure, you know, with where they go to New York and that was in like 1999 and all sorts of things like that. It's super weird, and some people take it to be conspiracy theories. But you know, speaking of time, I don't know if it's impossible for us to remember the future. Just personally,
can I share something on that? I was going to share it in an earlier discussion group. I don't recall which one, but now I really want to share.
Oh, please.
Yeah, go for it.
So, okay, during 9/11, I was living on North Hancock Street in Madison, Wisconsin, and down the corner from me, there was some, I don't remember if it was a coffee shop or a record shop. It was some hipster place. And the proprietor was this very artsy hipster guy. And I'd met him once or twice at some open mic. And basically the day after 9/11, I remember wandering around downtown Madison in a daze, you know, kind of trying to make sense of what had happened. And I wandered into this place. And the guy produced elaborate artwork that looked like it had taken him dozens of hours to complete. And he swore to God that he'd completed it the week before 9/11, and it depicted two planes crashing into two towers. So there's various
hard to document something like that, because you know it could have just been, but that I believe you. I totally believe you, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could explain it other ways, or you could believe me.
Wow.
Right.
But do you want to hear another weird 9/11 story? We're really off topic now.
I'll get us back. Don't worry.
So in Judaism, there's a day of mourning, an annual day of mourning for the destruction of the two temples. It's called Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is literally the 9th day of the 11th month. And there's, you know, a lot of, there's a concept in Kabbalah that you know, all of reality is a pattern. And so there's this concept that all these weird coincidences, it's not really coincidence, it's just sometimes when you look at the pattern the right way, you can see it. And that would be the explanation.
I mean, Hillman talks about 9/11 and he connects it with the Tower of Babel, which is in the 11th chapter of Genesis, right? Which is, I think, connected, which is, you know, it's the fall of a tower. If you see in the tarot deck, you know, that's the tower. That's what it looks like. Something striking the tower, people jumping off, right?
So interesting. So in the tarot deck, the original the original version, it's not originally called the tower, it was originally called the House of God. It was a depiction of the destruction of the temples.
That's interesting.
But it's a repeat. I mean, the Tower of Babel, again, in the Bible also has, you know how things repeat. The Tower of Babel is kind of like is kind of foreshadowing for the destruction of the temples. You know, when things get, when the institution gets rotten, it gets knocked down. That is the cycle.
That's really interesting. And I mean, the date itself is symbolic in other ways, right? You know, like it's an emergency number, right?
Yeah, I know. It's like,
Like it feels like a dream in a weird way. I feel like I've mentioned this before, but 2020 as a year feels like a dream in the same way. I mentioned this earlier, but it's 2020 vision. You know, it's the feeling of things becoming clear that were hidden, right? The idea of needing multiple perspectives to see clearly is very relevant, and the clash between perspectives, something like that, right? And something, yeah. But I just find, I guess the reason I mention this is because the reason I brought this up is there's a book called An Experiment with Time. You should look it up. It's from the 1940s, and he says that you can reliably anticipate the near future through your dreams as reliably as images from the past appear in your dreams from the past previous few days. And you can do this predictably and repeatedly. I mean, as much as dream symbolism can be repeatable, and not rigorously scientific as it would be nowadays, but many people have said this absolutely works, right? I had a professor of neuroscience at Westminster. I didn't do neuroscience. I just took a class from him or two. He says that one thing he thinks we'll be completely wrong about in 100 years, we'll realize we're completely wrong about is how time works. He thinks it's completely possible that we remember the future. Completely possible. I mean, like, how do we get into the future anyway? I mean, this is Socrates, right? The idea of anamnesis, right? How do we recognize what we've never seen before? Right? How do we recognize what we have no categories for if we don't already know what to expect? And I feel like that indicates a fundamental pre-conscious connection with what has yet to come. Something like that. I don't know, but it might be pseudoscientific, but there you go.
Almost seems like an argument for the circular view of time,
Right.
where you can describe it as circular only because you already know, in some sense, the patterns that have gone before.
Right.
Which I was going to bring up that I quite recommend Alexander Bard's work in terminology on nomadology versus eventology, where nomadology is the more original religion, which is circular, like based on the seasons, like our hunter-gatherer past, as well as Hinduism and most of Buddhism. And then eventology began with like Zoroastrianism, where humans, like the beginning of civilization, and then Judaism afterward, into the other Abrahamic religions, where there was the idea of an improvement and like a teleological linear view of history, where things could improve over generations. And Buddhism got into that a bit, maybe with Vajrayana, according to Bard's conception. But that maybe, I forget who's saying it, where the teleology is just kind of a temporary one within the larger perspective. So I was imagining maybe the teleology or eschatology, the linear view, if you zoom out, could maybe be revealed as like a tiny section of a circle, but you need kind of the linear view to get through that section of time, in a sense, maybe.
Or an interruption in the circular cycle, or the circular view that we'll eventually have to pay for. That's one way to, I mean, I read that book, you know, the Australian Aborigine book, Sand Talk. You may have heard of it. Wisdom. He talks about that. He says that he actually says, speaking of the Tower of Babel, there's a story very like the Tower of Babel in Aborigine mythology. It's really weird. It's about building a big project in many languages. Super, super bizarre, right? Of course, regional animals and regional cultures, but you know, same idea. But his big point is that why are there deserts around where there used to be ancient cities? There weren't deserts when they built those cities. I don't know if that's true, but it makes sense to me, right? That if you see where there's lots of desertification, it's in the Middle East, in the Sahara, right? And we arguably, maybe not, I don't know, you could make arguments against it. We did that with our agriculture and you know, because cities rely on the extra city, right? We can't grow food in the city, and so they're by definition parasitic, right? They're parasitic on the land. And I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that to the extent we have, as we all have, we've dissociated ourselves from this nomodology you mentioned, right?
Mhm.
Dissociated ourselves and cultivated a linear view of history, which we can't dissociate from and may have deeper meanings. In a sense, we're complicit in the end of time, right?
Hmm.
Complicit in that, and maybe that's the risk. Maybe it's something that maybe that's the risk of Western civilization, is to say that maybe this will bring about something that won't end in just destruction, or something like that. But maybe it will. I don't know. So fascinating to me that the revelation of the Messiah is so associated with destruction as well, right? That the revelation of that revelation is so that those two things seem connected. Maybe that's just my Christian bias. I don't know, but it seems to me that maybe the way to think about linear time is in those terms. I don't know.
Can I share a quote from Donnie Darko?
Sure.
Don't mind. I don't hope it's too far off. But they're so in the scene, the main character Donnie, he's talking to a professor about portals through space-time. So Donnie says, well, these portals, could these portals disappear anywhere at any time? She says, I think that's highly unlikely. No, I think that what you're talking about is an act of God. Donnie, well, if God controls time, then all time is pre-decided. She says, I'm not following you. Donnie says, every living thing follows along a set path. And if you could see your path or channel, then you could see into the future, right? Like it's a form of time travel. Professor says, well, you're contradicting yourself there, Donnie. If we were able to see our destinies manifest themselves visually, then we would be given a choice to betray our chosen destiny. And the mere fact that this choice exists would make all preformed destiny come to an end. And then it gets further into the movie. So I can't, yeah. So that was it.
What's really fascinating to me about that, Alexi, is that seems to be exactly what people experience in near-death experiences, and from what I've read, psychedelic trips, right? Is there's a sense that the entities you experience relate to time differently than you do. At least that's what I'm intuiting, right? Because sometimes they will like count down until the trip will end, but they're doing that a ways in the beginning, and of course it's melding time and expanding time, right? But it's weird. It's almost like they know what's going to happen before you do, right? But they are relating to you despite that. It's almost like they're existing in the future and they're projecting themselves back, something like that, right? And it's almost like it's this weird relationship of time, right? And in that connection, it reminds me of the life review, right, that people experience on NBCs, which is basically, you could consider it like an unwinding of time, right? Kind of like I don't know, like a way to think about, because that's kind of what you do when you dream, right? Is you are unwinding the day's memories to get to something more like a beginner's mind. I don't know. Those are just some of my thoughts, right? But I guess my big delight in what you pointed out, Alexi, is that it seems like that is possible to an extent. Have you heard of a book called Angels in My Hair? Anybody? It's a book by an Irish mystic. Her name's Lorna Byrne. She says that she's able to see angels and has been able to since she was a small child.
Oh, I have heard of her, yes.
Yeah, isn't she interesting? What have you heard, Stav?
I read an article about her. I saw one of her videos, and she says that she sees angels all around us.
Yeah, it's really interesting because she experiences these angels in the same way that people experience, like near-death experiences and psychedelic trips. It's like they come to her when she's a child. They say, you're going to marry this man, but he's going to die when he's older. But then she goes up and marries the man and he ends up dying. And you start to think that, like, does she know she's going to do this? Or is she relating to time differently than we are? Is the part of her that accesses these angels conscious? Right?
I actually have a really close friend who claims claims to be precognitive. So he says that he's waited to meet people before. Like, he's waited years to meet certain people, and he knows their names and everything. And he can't tell them that. He's like, yeah, I met this person, and I want to say, oh, hey, whatever your name was, but.
I mean, that on the surface, that seems to have philosophical problems because he could mess it up, right? But it seems to me that when I've heard of many things like that, right? But it seems to me that it ends up working. It ends up feeling like the hesitant it ends up, there's no grandfather paradox. It seems to work. I don't know.
I just got done teaching, so I had a unit on dystopian fiction with my 10th graders, and I just got finished teaching H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. This is all very on my mind and on my students' minds.
Interesting stuff. All right, I'm taking us back to the text. Okay, there was one other insightful bit I wanted to hit on in section 1 here. So on page 220, Nishitani basically differentiates two different aspects of time. So I'll read this bit I have highlighted here. The constant origination of new things, on the one hand, has the positive significance of genesis or creation. In that sense, time is a field of unlimited possibility in creative freedom, or rather, it is that very possibility itself. A time without beginning or end, within an infinite openness, displays an infinity of possibility. It enunciates the character or indefiniteness maintained by the possibilities we have within our nature as time being, or being time. On the other hand, this same constant origination is not something we could put a stop to, even if we wanted to. It gives us no rest, but pushes us ever forward. It makes us do things and tugs at us from within to keep turning us in new directions. This obligation to unceasing newness makes our existence an infinite burden to us. So I think
That
this
negative twist.
yeah, we got the positive and the negative here, but yeah, definitely ended with the negative. But I really think there's something to this, and I think it sets a nice stage for some of the stuff about history he's going to try and reconcile in the coming sections, because it's hard to deny the newness in life. You have certain experiences, you meet certain people, you realize certain things, and that feels totally new. But that is also deeply connected to this sort of being at doing, this kind of forceful burden on us. But these aren't two separate realities. These are just two different exposures of the same phenomena. So, but I really like how he sort of ties in impermanence, becoming, nihility, and time kind of all together, because it makes sense. I mean, if you have impermanence, there's something essentially temporal about that. Something is impermanent from one time to another. If you're only in space and you're not in time, you can only speak of finitude and not impermanence. So I think that connection is really well. It lands well. But on the flip side, the positive of that is that, hey, you can have new things come. Impermanence isn't only the sort of disillusion of things that already exist. It's also the finite coming into being of new things. So it's difficult to wrestle with, but I think this two-faced or two aspects of time is an important idea here.
That actually reminds me of I saw today there's a new type of bacteria that they found on the ruins of the Titanic that is eating rust. And also there's a new type of mushroom that was discovered that grows from plastic.
From plastic?
Yeah, it decomposes plastic.
That's encouraging. That's really encouraging.
Yeah, I mean, natural history, biological history is a history of emergence and newness.
Can
Certainly.
you eat this mushroom, or is it?
I don't know.
Okay. Well, I hope it's a psychedelic mushroom.
You want to eat plastic? I don't know.
I don't know.
And
Well,
maybe-
something that was plastic. I'll help.
Doesn't
I'll,
store.
I'll spread its seeds in my poop somehow. I don't know.
So maybe instead of visions of nature and our evolutionary heritage, if you get high on this mushroom, it would give you visions of like factories and stuff where the plastic was made.
I mean, that's just DMT, isn't it? I mean, DMT is like really technological and science fiction-y, isn't it? From
The
what I've
machine
heard.
elves. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, which is interesting. Which is like so utterly. It seems so remarkably chemically similar to ayahuasca, but ayahuasca is so different. It's like from what I've heard, it's like all the nature beings and feminine and earth mysteries, and it's just not even.
Yeah, what exactly is the pharmacology behind that? There's like one additional chemical in one of them that just like throws the whole thing.
Yeah, it's like you start to think that it's not just chemicals at this point or something. You start to think that there's something like morphic resonance happening. And
Has anyone here read Jeremy Narby's The Cosmic Serpent? Oh gosh.
Guess who's contacting Interlibrary Loan right now?
Yeah, I mean you can probably get it on PDF too. You'll love this one.
Why have privileges if you can't abuse them? I'm going to abuse my privileges. So, but what's this book about?
I took it way away from the text there.
No, I'm curious. What's this book, The Cosmic Serpent?
I am hesitant to summarize it since it's been a good decade since I read it, but it's one of these anthropologist or ethnobotanist goes to the Amazon and tries the wares, and he's reporting back to civilization what he finds. And a lot of it is about how, in these tribes, how is the knowledge of these different psychedelic compounds passed down? And they'll all swear to you that it comes from the plants themselves, that, you basically go out into the bush and you sleep and you have a dream and the plant appears to you. It tells you how to consume it in order to have the appropriate experience. So he talks a lot about our connection with plants on a conscious and subconscious level and how they are driving our behavior.
It seems like there's a picture on the cover here of a serpent in a twisting coil and then the DNA double helix. So that seems
tells you everything you need to know about this.
That's interesting. I'll say something off topic while we're off topic. There's a Sufi teacher. His name is Llewellyn Vaughan Lee, and you should look him up if you don't. You know him, Jared. Yeah. Yep. One of the things I really like him, and one of the things he says that I think is brilliant is that world change has never happened. Well, meaningful world change tends to happen through small groups of friends. And you look at history, and that actually is true. The Renaissance started that way in Florence, right? You have the American Revolution starting that way. Cafes in Boston and Philadelphia, things like that. The French. The American artists in Paris in the 1920s, right? It seems to me that, and the way Llewellyn Vaughan Lee connects it is to say that there's almost like a consciousness, a spiritual light connection that arises when we have discussions like this. To me,
I think of Stav will appreciate. I think of the Ramchal in his circle. It's a flattering comparison.
Right. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I need to look that up, but I feel like what we're doing here is more important than it seems. I do get the feeling. It might be naive of me, it might be grandiose of me, but it gets me feeling like because we saw the Dugan guy talking about the same thing on the Stoa, which was super weird.
Well, and in that context, I was thinking of the milieu out of which Dugan arose, right? Which is these samizdat circles. There's a literary circle trading bootleg esoteric literature in the Soviet Union. I mean, when I read about that, I was like, where is this circle in
But
America today?
I think it's we're maybe in it is the thing. I guess what
Yeah.
I'm trying to say is that things tend to happen at the same time. You know, calculus was invented by Leibniz and Newton at the same time. It's like Jung talks about how a small addition of a chemical will kind of do something drastic, just a small addition if you're over the threshold. I feel like we're helping. I really do. We're helping with the field, you know.
Yeah.
And I do get that impression, or at least it's my hope.
Good use of the word field. That was good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So a while back I sent that other Nishitani reading group to our chat, and so that's through a organization run by this Heideggerian scholar, and I just ended up talking to one of the members there last night, and I found out they're about to read Corban's Alone with the Alone, entirely.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so yeah, it's fascinating that like totally parallel trajectories that have
It makes
been,
me wonder what Corban is doing on the other side. You know, I wonder if it makes me feel like
Drink sake with Nishitani.
Yeah, I know for sure. But I feel I don't know. I hope that if Corban is on the other side, he'd be very interested in all of us. I hope he would be, because I feel like he would have a vested interest in the dissemination and the extrapolation of his ideas in a new context. I think that is, whether you take it literally or metaphorically, something we can take heart from.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. Certainly, Corban and Nishitani are in their own senses sort of both coming out of this kind of Heideggerian philosophical milieu, and then they go east. For Corban, it's a sort of a journey, and for Nishitani, it's a homecoming. But that's where they land, and sort of via this Heideggerian philosophical education, they project philosophy back west then. And I don't know, it's very, very interesting and pertinent in the context of just all the pluralism we're faced with today.
One thing Rudolf Steiner said, really interestingly, was that the world will only achieve its purpose in this period of its evolution, is his phrase, right? Is if we're able to articulate Eastern wisdom and Western philosophical language, which is really interesting, right? Basically, he's saying only if we use the capacities of the West, our philosophical capacities, to articulate instinctive wisdom, will we achieve the purpose of this time. I think is exactly what we're doing.
Can I take it back to the text for a moment?
Please.
So that was something which interested me a lot in the last section. I've said this before in other discussion sections. It's basically how impressed I am that how well Nishitani knows the Western tradition, much better than the overwhelming majority of philosophers in the Western tradition. And so I was pretty interested in his analysis in the previous section, in Shunyata and Time, where he talks about Toynbee. I've mentioned it a couple times. A professor of mine in college named Lawrence Dickey, who really went deep into the Western tradition. And one of the books I read with him was a work called Meaning in History by Carl Lewith. Has anyone heard of this work? Have anyone heard of Lewith? I'll put him in the chat. It was interesting for me to hear him attribute sort of these ideas to Toynbee, because I'm more familiar with them through Lewith. And he in this book, Meaning in History, Lewith basically breaks down 3 progressions of the idea of progress throughout the Western intellectual tradition. He talks about religious progress. Let's see, religious progress in religion, and modern religions of progress. So he basically talks about the idea of religious progress in a theist or Christian context as being basically the voyage of the soul upwards. independently of secular authority. This is what Augustine outlines. Then he talks about in the Protestant Reformation, us developing this awareness of progress in religion, right? How religion itself can become ethicized and improved over time, and how this finally leads to an awareness of these modern religions of progress, which basically elevate this evolutionary function to a religion in and of itself. So in the afterword to this book, he treats Nietzsche's eternal recurrence of the same. So Nishitani basically picks up where he leaves off. He does cite Herbert Butterfield, who wrote a very similar book on meaning and history, but he doesn't talk about Lewith. So anyway, it got Lewith back on my mind. Let me put that in the back in the chat.
Yeah, it reminds me, I wanted to get to what he was saying, where he was comparing the secularism, Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, and the Platonic Christian viewpoints. Like he said, that in the secular progress narrative, time became independent of eternity, in a sense, of temporal things, and that the things of this world were able to be considered from within the confines of this world. Like there was no trans-temporal dimension. And yet within the secular frame, time is, it's not really directly made explicit, but like by the way things work within that frame, time is infinitely stretching in both directions, the past and the future, which kind of kills the teleological, the traditional Platonic Christian teleological model of a linear view of history and eschaton and so on, which allows for what he calls the infinite drive. So kind of like just people following each activity becomes its own end and can lead to addiction and so on. And then he said like the Platonic Christian model had, actually he said Plato kind of went back to the past, like the pre-intellectual forms, and then Christianity pointed more toward the future. So, but they both had a trans-temporal dimension that secularism kind of got rid of. And then obviously comparing that to Nietzsche as well, where he critiqued the will to power as still like a being that's being reified in some sense, even though it tried to get away from those other two issues. Yeah, I'd be curious for thoughts on that.
So I was really interested in this, where he talks about, how did you put it, how these different spheres become ends in and of themselves. Because this is, for me, this is really connected with the project of modernity in general, of separating out these spheres of knowledge, right? Philosophy from theology, from natural sciences and whatnot. And so he's talking about another facet of this, is once these domains of knowledge are separated from one another, then they become ends in themselves. They're not in service to a greater objective. Yeah.
It reminds me of Jonathan Peugeot, who talked about how there wouldn't have been a school shooter in a medieval village, because everything was integrated into a common narrative and in the community, and it's the realization of the individual that allowed alienation. And and that's a big critique of Jordan Peterson, right? Is that the individual is not the end all be all, even though they agree in many respects. He says the individual should be lower in the hierarchy than it maybe is for others, right? That unity and the angels and God should be higher. And I think that's valuable, because you're right that we have fractured. Our world is diabolic, which is the opposite of symbolic, which literally means diabolic means to throw apart. Symbolic means to cast together, right? So the demonic, the diabolical means to disintegrate. The symbolic is to integrate into a greater whole, like literally etymologically.
Interesting. Yeah, I think the bit that Andrew, you were talking about is most brought out towards the bottom of 235. He writes, "May we not say that in such realms as the study of nature in science, the technical revolutions of technology, the pursuits of social progress, and even the areas of sexuality, sports, and the like, a driving dynamic oriented to the infinite has come to the fore. In all these realms of life, there slumbers a particular heat or passion, and this means that along with secularization, each of the various facets of human existence becomes autotelic. Each, as it were, becomes autonomous. Each begins to contain a kind of infinity, an infinite finitude. In thus becoming autotelic, all fields of human endeavor become aimless. They cease to be subordinate to anything higher than themselves, to make it their own end, and to serve as its substratum. Along with the collapse of the teleological system of a divine world order, the hierarchy of values it implied also collapsed.
Yes, that is the part I was talking about. It's interesting to me how that's reflected in art at the time that he's talking about. This is where you see the rise of a notion of art for art's sake.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, on the next page he says, within that time, with the infinite time and stretching both directions, every function of life as something that is autotelic and therefore aimless is given over to the unrestricted pursuit of itself. It is here that the infinite drive, or what may be termed self-will, is to be seen. And yet, at the same time, some of this sounds kind of like what he was talking about, the Unschuld des Werdens, like the innocence of becoming that Nietzsche was advocating for, where it's like a beyond, it's atelic or trans-teleological. So I'm wondering like how those would contrast, because he seems to be like, this one sounds kind of negative, and then the innocence of becoming is a more like positive, life affirming, creative force. But maybe you can only get to that once you've gone through the nihility, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah, that's probably how I'd think about it. So it seems like in the quote I just read, we're kind of stuck on nihility as a ground, and so the autotelic aspect is only based on this nihility. So it is disconnected and negated in some strange ways. Where if it was grounded in this deeper level of shunyata, there would be sort of a recognition of the aimlessness of it in a way that kind of implies the interconnectedness with all other things that he's talked about with some of this like master slave language. So yeah, it doesn't give us a super clear picture yet, but I think there's a sense of it that's in the Nietzsche's will to power already, but he certainly has his critique there that we mentioned. So I think what needs to happen is to that deeper sort of conversion to shunyata, and getting away from only viewing this through the lens of will, which is kind of a micro teleology in its own sort of sense, and it implies a subject that is willing versus sort of a gestalt that is kind of drawing the aspect out of the subject or something like that. So getting that sort of two-way process of like both master and slave in all contexts, I think is probably what the proper view of these things would be. So like, for example, there is like art for art's sake, and you could look at all the material conditions that allow for art, and the education of artists and their apprenticeship under certain masters, and this all supports this aimless endeavor of art. But then you can also look at where art serves all these different things. It's the point that allows communities to come together. It beautifies a space. It allows for interpretation, and it's both this slave and master simultaneously. And so I don't know, all sorts of kind of non-teleological relations kind of just bubble up from there, and you can't say that it's just the art that is willing this, because there's other actors that are willing onto the art and pulling out from it, and those actors are equally sort of have the will of the art imposed on them. And so even just talking about it as will as the only sort of form of relation doesn't quite capture the sort of reciprocal nature of all these relations that are kind of self and other based in strange ways. So
About
Yeah,
art,
that's good.
if you go back to a little bit before art for art's sake, because that's late 19th century, right? A lot before, but like to the beginning, to the end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the Renaissance, right? You start to get towards modernity, less attention, more, let me put it this way, more attention to geometrical space, right? More attention to the objective, realistic, sensory medium that objects are placed into, which paradoxically makes the world a lot lonelier, right? That's the whole idea of the pre-Raphaelites, right? That you want to go before Raphael to get to that place where, as you said, it's the gestalt, a structure of a hierarchy of being. It's all integrated symbolically, even if it's not realistic. Because if realism makes the fallacy of assuming that the way things look is the way things are, right? It makes the fallacy of saying that you cannot read the world, right? That the world has no significance, right? And that's an assumption, right? Of course, the world. I mean, if books had no significance, they'd be meaningless, right? Like look at this Nishitani book. Look at all these squiggles, Look at all these squiggles. They're so. I mean, they just follow each other completely randomly. I mean, if you look at it, it's just like. But the idea that together something more arises from the concatenation of many meaningless things, right? Through the gestalt, through the context, and I guess I just feel like the era that Nishitani is critiquing, this philosophical attitude of privileging the external over the internal, so to speak. Privileging, I mean, you could put it that way, right? But privileging the way things appear to the senses and to the intellect over, the belonging together of the world with itself.
I was just going to say there's a very good passage on what you were just discussing in Alone with the Alone, right, where he talks about the diagram of the Kaaba.
Yeah. I can find that one and shoot an image to our chat for sure. And anything, I think we should probably try and dive in a bit more to this bit with Nietzsche and eternal recurrence. As we've talked to before, Nishitani has a sort of mixed opinion of Nietzsche. He says he gets closer to a lot of these ideas than a lot of other Western philosophers do, but that he doesn't quite get far enough, or perhaps near enough, since we're ultimately going to the absolute near side here.
A lot of people say that about Nietzsche, don't they? Right? Cheetham says that about Nietzsche. He says he's a failed initiate. Steiner says that about Nietzsche. He says he uses the exact same words, actually. Failed initiate. And I've heard other people say similar ideas. So I think there's something to that.
Interesting. Yeah. So on 231 is where we basically find Nishitani's praise of Nietzsche's version of this vision of the eternal recurrence. So I'll read a couple of these little bits here. Nietzsche's eternal recurrence means that we are led to the existence of a great death, as great as the world itself. The eternal return of world time means the realization of that great death. And then a little later, he says, this nihility becomes manifest as such an existential death as our own great death. It occurs en route to what Nietzsche has in mind when he says, when you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss starts gazing back into you. That is the self-prehension of nihility, what has been called above participation in nihility. So what Nietzsche is great at is sort of undermining some of these problematic teleologies that both Platonic Christianity and secularism had set up, as well as sort of the earlier mythic representations of time. So the eternal recurrence is very effective in that regard, in sort of sweeping the stage clean of these teleologies that are ultimately only sort of partial visions of time. But 234 is where we get the critique of Nietzsche. So Nishitani writes, Nietzsche's standpoint of eternal recurrence and the will to power was not able fully to realize the meaning of the historicity of historical things. And the fundamental reason for this lies in the fact that the will to power, Nietzsche's final standpoint, was conceived as some thing called will. So long as it is regarded as an entity named will, it does not completely lose its connotation of being an other for us, and thus cannot become something wherein we can truly become aware of ourselves at an elemental source, at our elemental source. So yeah, we're stuck in this representational paradigm where we, in a way, aren't participating subjectively in the will to power. Certainly, a human being can will, but what it would be to exist as will is in that subjective sense is not encapsulated well in Nietzsche's vision here, or at least that's what Nishitani seems to think. So that idea of appropriating of sort of the subject. I mean, he uses this language like existing as time or something like that. Is somewhat absent from this will to power standpoint because it's stuck in this representationalism. And then also he says that this eternal recurrence is not able to reconcile the historical. Basically, it doesn't have this second aspect of time that we touched on earlier of the new that comes forth. It only has sort of this idea of recurrence, of coming back. So it doesn't quite incorporate the proper idea of impermanence as Nishitani sees it.
Yeah.
I thought it was very interesting his quip about how the will to power still is an entity. It's still some type of being. So Nietzsche it would have been great to know if Nietzsche ever could have responded to that, because one of his big criticisms of his day was that there were all these social movements that believed they were atheists or believed that they had gotten rid of God. But he said, no, actually, they're just different incarnations of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, he felt this way about democracy and socialism, where socialism, he would say, he wrote about how socialism is exactly like Christianity, because it's still a slave morality. It's still about healing the masses and giving the masses what they need, and fear of the unique, and fear of the powerful. He said this, it's the same exact value system, but they're pretending that they've gotten over God.
Mm-hmm.
And then so Nishitani is saying, well, it turns out Nietzsche hasn't really gotten over God either. He has his own mythology,
Mm-hmm.
and his God is the will to power. And it's interesting. It's like, yeah, I guess he's kind of right. Like he has this entity at the heart of his mythology, of his worldview.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, okay. So that I want to piggyback off that. That gets into one of the most interesting questions in Judaism for me, which is it possible to be without idolatry?
Yeah, because you're always making another idol, and that's like Nietzsche. Like Nietzsche's making another. He thinks he's done, but no, he just made another idol. He just constructed another one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean it's the critique is, well, to what extent is shunyata not an idol? I mean, we got all this whole chat about how it's no thing, it's emptiness, but I mean, this is still a metaphysically strong system here. So I
Well,
think there's space for critique there, certainly.
What's the difference between idea and image? Because the critique of the idolatry is forbidding images, right, but not ideas. Would you say that's true, or how would you, or is that maybe too simplistic?
Well, if you read the Torah literally, it's avodah zara, foreign worship is literally, it's the idol. But then you see in subsequent generations they expanded that, where it could be any rigid conception of the divine really becomes idol worship. And then there's contemporary people who are just who interpret that to an extreme abstraction.
What's very interesting to me, Alan Watts once says that the Bible should be ritualistically burned every Easter Sunday because it becomes an idol, right? And this seems, at least in early Mormonism, this was a very strong, this is a strong feeling, is the feeling like we are transcending sectarianism by welcoming in all truth, right? It kind of turns into a Borg thing, an appropriation thing with its own kind of problems, right? But at least the feeling at the beginning was something very like that. We don't want to be hemmed in by doctrine. We don't want, and it leads to kind of an inconsistency, right? That's going to give its own problems. And it's kind of imaged in polygamy in a way, right? But you start to see that I'm really sympathetic to that perspective, when we put it that way. The idea that Joseph Smith once said, I've never heard of a man damned for believing too little. I've never heard of a man damned for believing too much, only for believing too little. And I really do I really take root in that, right? The belief that I have to look at the world through as many different perspectives as possible, and to avoid a kind of an entropy into idolatry, really, or what you might call it. I don't know if you'd call it that, but
Right.
I suppose we know what we're talking about.
Yeah, I feel like Tillich is helpful here. Certainly, Cheatham's own book we already mentioned, All the World in Icon, and also the one I just finished, The Speculative Grace, the Object-Oriented Theology. He talks briefly about this and how the idolaters and the iconoclasts are sort of operating on this same kind of paradigm. They're just on the opposite sides of it, where the iconoclast is sort of rejecting all things and refusing to see God at all in basically anything, and the idolater is reducing God to something, and the truth is sort of between these, or transcendent from these, where you get bits and pieces of God in all things, and it's a he described it as an iconophilic perspective. So you're able to see the grace or the divinity.
We might actually be able to get Adam Miller and Tom Cheatham to have a conversation.
That'd be fun.
I've met Adam Miller.
We will have fulfilled our providential function.
No, seriously. I mean, I've met Adam Miller before. I've talked with him several times, and you've met Tom Cheatham before, so we could just pull our strength and make this happen.
Yeah,
talk about icons and idols. See what happens.
Yeah, that would likely be a very exciting conversation.
So. Yeah, actually. Oh, go ahead, Stav.
I was going to go back to Nishitani. So, there is this paradox that he does have his words and his ideas, and it's his own mythology or theology, but he does often retreat and say the words aren't going to help you, and logos is a waste of time, and the only truth is when you let go of all your words and just embrace full nothingness and full silence. So there.
Yeah, that's certainly something he has going for him here, with the very genuinely religious sort of approach he takes to these matters. One other thing I wanted to say in terms of Nietzsche being sort of stuck in a very Christian paradigm in a certain way. Uh, I keep having this sort of idea. So he has this big uh, statement that he's so well known for. God is dead, and I keep thinking, what could be a more Christian thing than that? Literally, this religion is based on the execution of Jesus, who is God, and this is where the salvation is
God is
grounded in
dead
this
and he hath
tradition.
risen.
What?
God is dead and he hath risen.
Yeah, yeah.
This, you know, this is really saying what you're saying, right? In Jung's
Mhm.
Red Book, he says, yes, God is dead, but we're going to give him rebirth, right? That's the whole, this is the central image of this book, is the rebirth of God in the soul.
Mhm.
And it's taking directly from Nietzsche, right? But there are Christian overtones there, obviously. But he also says that Christianity has been overturned as well, right?
Mhm.
That he says something very interesting. He says that just as Jesus restored bloody pagan rituals, i.e., the eating of flesh and blood, we should restore what was earlier, so to speak. He says all the going further always involves the reintroduction of what had been discarded in the past, which is, shadow work. It's what ends up being the shadow in Jung.
But to be fair to Nietzsche, I mean, the whole point, I think you're right. God is dead is definitely a statement within the Christian context.
Yeah.
But that was like the main thesis of his work. I mean, he had a book called The Antichrist. I mean, he specifically wanted to, God is dead, he's not risen, as is implied, and he's not going to rise. And that was a I mean, he really hated Christianity. That was a big deal. That was an
But I
intentional.
mean, to hate Christianity is a very strong statement about Christianity. I know there's a fable in the Hindu tradition about an atheist who spends his whole life cursing God and then goes to heaven and says, hey, why did I wind up here? And, because you spent your whole life focused on God.
that seems so apropos to my tradition, because there is one of the biggest subreddits on Reddit is r/x Mormon, and you will not find a bigger religious community.
Yeah.
I mean, it is so devoted, so reverent. They're so rigorous in their attendance. It's like you think that, to me, what this speaks to is cultural conditioning, right? It speaks to the fact that we cannot escape our upbringing. We cannot escape the structures that we interpret the world through, even if we reject those structures, because we're doing it from those structures. Hang on just a minute here.
Yeah, the point you
sorry.
brought up with Jesus reinvigorating some of the pagan practices of like eating of the blood and the wine, or the bread and the body, reminded me of and then the rebirth of it is the tack that Jonathan Peugeot seems to take, that it's a historical death and rebirth of Christianity.
Yeah.
I don't know how that'll go, but that's an interesting perspective. And then how Nishitani says in regards to the views of time, that the Aufhebung, Hegel's word, like the synthesis in some sense, I think some people try to translate it as the sublimation, has yet to be really reached between Christianity and secular progress and the eternal recurrence as well. So some kind of new reintegration of that seems to be what's being headed toward, and is trying to work toward that synthesis.
One thing that I find very interesting about books like the Book of Revelation, but also the Book of Mormon, is that they are books about books. And I think that what's interesting about that is that whenever you have a book about a book, the book will end up describing the reception of the book. In other words, whenever you have a book about a book like itself, the reception of the book will end up resembling the book. And to me, that seems like almost like, if you just speak in terms of the Book of Revelation, for instance, you begin with the angel giving a book to John to eat, right? It's all about his reaction to a text. And I wonder if we could read Christian history as a reaction to the Book of Revelation, in that sense, right? Christian history as a reaction, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy in the Oedipal sense, like the Oedipus myth, right? That to the extent we see the world in terms of the Book of Revelation, it will turn into the Book of Revelation.
Now, do you know about the historicity of? My understanding is the Book of Revelation was introduced quite a while after the rest of the book.
I think so. Yeah. But I find it very interesting because it seems to, that would almost work in my point's favor, because it suggests a kind of a trans-historical attitude. It seems to mold history. It's like, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov, right? You know what I'm talking about. It's psychohistory. That's what it is, right? It's playing it's playing chess with Western history, which I think is what ultimately, if you read the Gospels, that's what Jesus was trying to do. Honestly, he talks about that, for better or for worse. I think part of what we're going to have to do in this time is, for better or for worse, the overcoming of Christianity. Maybe the fulfillment of Christianity at the same time, but also the overcoming of it. I think those two might be the same thing, right? That any time we overcome something, we also fulfill its purpose. I mean, that's what a task is, right? And so I think that, I don't know, I guess my point is that, with this linear history thing, it seems to be planned out that way.
Well, I have a good friend who says that he claims that the big spiritual quest of our age is to become the Antichrist, which is the notion is that there's going to be a savior and there's going to be a big change, everything's going to be great, there's going to be this big apocalyptic end to history. The Antichrist is the opposite of that, which is, no, there's not going to be any apocalyptic end. We don't need to save the world. We need to embrace how limited we are. We need to embrace that we're animals. So your idea kind of resonated with me. That maybe the ultimate fulfillment is that we need to let go of this dream, of this grandiose vision of a complete transformation.
I mean, to me, that's the Abraham and Isaac story, right? Is that you feel like you have to do this tremendous sacrifice until the moment, right? And because there's a sense in which, that, I mean, that's how nature works. That's how the human body works. Have you ever vomited before? It feels really awful until it doesn't, I mean, everything works like that in nature. Thunderstorms work that way. Childbirth works that way. It climaxes and then it stops, right? And I mean, and I feel like that's how history is going to work too, right? It'll climax.
Yeah, we have to realize we don't have to sacrifice our son. We don't have to.
Yeah, exactly. But we need to go through that experience, I think, for some reason or other, right? It's I mean, that's what we do in narratives. That's what we do in books. We like the climax, right? We like the feeling of things almost not being okay, but then being okay. And I feel like, of course, that's how history's going to work.
Yeah, it's like we have to do in order to feel like we being, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? I mean, that's what you experience in Zazen, right? Zazen really works to be the abandonment of narrative by its exaggeration, right? That's a dramatic acceleration of that process. And I feel like maybe we're living out that process on a grand scale. Swedenborg would call this a temptation. It's his word for it. He says it's the moment where evil spirits consummate themselves by self-destruction, where they reach a limit where they are no longer able to project outward but collapse inward, right? This is the Luciferic, right? It's the fall from heaven, right? That's the idea, is that it's no longer rising, but in the light of truth, it is now as it is, which is very low, something like that.
All right, I actually got a skedaddle here. Any quick final thoughts for this evening?
I do have a thought I've been sitting on. If you got a skedaddle, can you maybe pass over because
Sure.
I got something I want to say.
Sure. I'll just quick close out here, and then I'll leave the Zoom open for you. So reading for next time, we're digging in more to Shunyata and history, section 4 through 7, pages 237 through 265. So good luck, and thank you for yet another wonderful chat this evening. So,
Thanks, Jared.
yep, thank you.
So Andrew, what's your comment?
Okay, I got a couple things. So I want to rewind back to the idolatry discussion because I have a couple connected thoughts. Last week I talked about the 7 Noahide laws, and most of them being commonsensical in most religious traditions, with the exception of the no idolatry, which is kind of a deal breaker for most.
Right.
So okay, that's one thought. Connected thought is, it's really interesting to me on both sides of the equation. On the theistic side of the equation, you have all these sort of quasi-polytheist, sort of projectionist, intermediaries that appear, right? Whether they be saints or rabbis or imams or sephira or these different sort of intermediary realms, right? And then you have these different explanations within the tradition about how, well, this isn't really idolatry, it's actually a this, right? But what's interesting to me is on the non-theistic or polytheistic side of the equation, then you have similar explanations about how actually all our gods represent one totality, right? So you have this sort of explaining away on both sides of the equation, whether you're coming from the theist side or the polytheist side. And then the third sort of thought I had, I was reading. I'm sorry. Oh, okay. The Hirschfeld annotation of the Tanakh, right? Sort of a 19th century, early 20th century Victorian kind of Orthodox Jewish guy, and he talks about how if there is a providential mission of the Jewish people to the nations, it has as much to do with demonstrating what God is not than with what God is, right? So that this is a and that kicks right back to our discussion about positive and negative theology earlier. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to say on the subject of idolatry.
It makes me wonder if idolatry is not a final, or it's not a commandment for all times, but it is a commandment designed to facilitate a specific type of activity in human consciousness at a specific time. Because the Jewish people were very unique that way, right? Weren't they at the time, right? I have a book right here, Saving the Appearances by Owen Barfield. He says that, and I don't know I don't want you'll think of this, but I find it very provocative. He says that the place of the Jews in the history of the earth is the place which memory occupies in the composition of an individual man. I think it's very interesting. And what he means by that is that it is the ability to say I am to oneself, which depends on removing oneself from participation in the environment by a prohibition of identifying the absolute with the environment. So I wonder if the prohibition against idolatry is to develop something very specific in human consciousness that is very important. What do you think about that?
Me personally?
Or anybody, yeah.
So it would be a removal of the conflation of the environment with oneself in order to better understand oneself.
I think it would be something like that. I need to understand Barfield more, because it's quite difficult to understand. I think what he's saying is something like the path from original participation, where you are no longer, where you think in terms of the environment, where you metaphorize, right? Where you're a pagan, right? That's what that is, right? What the purpose of idolatry is to move us beyond paganism, right? Is to move us beyond the assumptions of paganism to something greater, right?
I'm sorry, the purpose
the prohibition
of iconoclasm, right?
Iconoclasm, right?
Yeah.
Iconoclasm, excuse me. The prohibition against idolatry. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and okay. From that perspective, okay, I'm sorry, my brain's working full overtime right now.
Mhm.
Uh, yeah, I'm led to think of the concept of objectivity, right? Is it possible to be truly objective? Everyone brings their own subjective perception to a scenario, right? You know, so I mean, even on the level of the media, right? Can any source of information be trusted to be truly objective, or is it all a power play, right? So I would argue in both of these instances that the attempt to be objective or the attempt to not have idols, even if you fail, you still succeed through the attempt,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Are Christians with me? Is everyone else with
Oh,
me?
for sure. I mean, it's the subject object dichotomy, right? You are developing a capacity to individuate, right? You are objectifying your environment and you're building an I, right?
Right.
Which is important. You're building a tabernacle. You're building a vessel for the Godhead that is not participatory in the naive sense, but has distilled spirit from matter, right? Am I getting to what you're trying to say?
I mean,
Andrew?
I think you're building further on what I'm trying to say, but if you understood what I'm trying to say, then I'm happy.
But yeah, I hope I do, right? But I feel like it's it's a really cool thing that we just hit on, right? That I feel like iconoclasm is important. It's very important, but it also has a function in a bigger ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I think understanding it as a developmental stage is important.
Yeah, yeah,
The question is then what lies beyond that.
right,
Well,
yeah,
and as like a reaction when idolatry is rampant. Like I'm not sure. I suppose you could take a developmental stage, but Vervecchio I think also has a really useful frame on this that can connect to McGill-Chris, where an icon as opposed to an idol is translucent, where it has like it's a gestalt or a symbol because it's referring to something that can't be reduced to like a single definition, like an archetype as well. Whereas an idol, like it's opaque in the sense that you sort of stop at it and just like worship that, whether you realize you're worshiping it. Whereas an icon or symbol like draws you beyond. It's like a vehicle in a sense, so it draws you toward the more broad associations, manifold associations, and archetypes, in addition to like the divine one potentially. And iconoclasm is like necessary as a balance for when idolatry becomes too common. It's kind of like an opponent processing idolatry, well, not really opponent processing, but you want the translucency, not the opacity, which is idolatry, nor the complete transparency, which is just iconoclasm and refusing that there's any meaning.
Any particularity.
That's
Yeah.
very
Myth
valuable.
that you don't know is what it's
And the right hemisphere like has that ability to have the translucency, whereas the left hemisphere tends to view things in like zeros and ones. Either it's purely opaque or it's purely transparent.
That's very interesting. One
Yep.
thing oh, sorry, yeah,
The Rambam, Maimonides wrote very much about Avodah Zarah, idol worship. The reason why it was so strictly prohibited, he described how primitive the Israelites were in Egypt, how they literally would worship wind and worship stones and worship trees, and there was such a stern prohibition in order to get people off what he described as their absurd superstition and their dependency on their on just their on their on the, and basically describes their ignorance. But then he goes at it initiates a progression of people to conceive of the divine in increasingly abstract terms, and the ultimate pinnacle is basically to admit that we're completely incapable of comprehending the divine, and that all we can start to describe is what the divine is not. And then the Kabbalists went farther, is that for them, they actually created two separate levels of the divine. There's kind of the creator God of the Bible that we can talk about and haggle about, but there's a higher level of the divine that you can't even describe, that they would say on that we can't, it's forbidden to discuss because we just have to admit that our words are entirely incapable. So there's that whole continuum of worshiping a rock is the lowest of the low, and the highest of the high is when we relinquish all words.
Yeah, and I think idolatry becomes dangerous when they try to reduce the thing that you have to recognize as beyond your comprehension as something that can be comprehended and grasped.
Yeah,
like fundamentalism
One
does.
thing that I find very interesting about Jewish scripture is that even though idolatry is prohibited, and I don't think this is hypocritical at all, you will not find anything more image-laden or poetic as Isaiah, right? Right? It's poetry, right? It's not imagistic, right? But there's something to me deeply meaningful about that, right? Which is that the more you prohibit this naive participation in images, the more the images withdraw inward, something more creative, right? Inward, right? Image capacity is born. Maybe something like Owen Barfield would call final participation, right? Where it has withdrawn into the human tabernacle, so to speak. And I don't know what I don't know what I think about that, but it seems like to the extent you don't believe images literally, you can use them to great effect.
So from that perspective, and we lost Jared, who would probably have the most interesting perspective on this, but as far as I know, Judaism never went quite as far as Islam in prohibiting images.
Right. But there is that tendency, right? A little bit.
Yeah, I can definitely see how the tendency in Islam grows out of Judaism, and is
right.
It's in that tradition.
Right. And I want to echo Stav's point, because you read the book of Exodus, right? And you start to get the sense that they really wanted to worship these idols. They were not in the same space we were in, right?
That golden calf and Baal, they keep relapsing, right? It's like they're a drug. They keep relapsing and bad things happen. And even King Solomon started dabbling in his idols a little bit. They all it was a reoccurring problem for them.
It's like God was trying to break a people out of instinct. It's almost like God was trying to break a people out of what they have always done, what their biology tells them to do.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And it seems to me that function maybe has been successful in a way, right? Because we no longer think like that as much. I mean, not just Jewish people, but the whole world tends to not go rushing after golden calves. Maybe we do. I don't know. What do you think?
That goes back to what Andrew said earlier, which is like, I don't know if we ever can escape idol worship. Our idols may just look very different nowadays.
Right. But I wonder, I do feel we're a lot more disconnected than we're a lot more disconnected from participating in the world than those people in the wilderness.
To me, the interesting question is this God's will for us or not?
Right.
We appear to be evolving in this transhuman trajectory.
Right.
Is that what is desired of us? And if not, how do we avert it?
Wittgenstein said something very interesting, which is also something Rudolf Steiner says. It's not a linear development. The rate of development is kind of differential, right? In the sense that the direction changes at every point, right? So to speak, that we can't predict the future unless we're in it, right? But it's like it's not random, it's not tremendously fluctuating. It's more like the rate of change also changes, something like that. And I wonder if we're evolving towards something that we can't see yet.
I was about to say, so I could continue this discussion another hour. I have to go. It looks like
Jared's going to kick us out, actually.
All right, thanks, guys.
Okay, talk to you guys later. Bye.